The fire pit at the center of the pack grounds roared higher than it had in 10 years, and every eye in the crowd was fixed on the wooden platform where Elena stood, waiting for the words that would change her life. She wore a pale blue dress that her mother had chosen for her, and her hands were folded in front of her so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Tonight was the night the Alpha King would finally say the words she had waited 3 years to hear. Tonight, Damien would call her his Luna, in front of the entire pack. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her back, but she only cared about one pair. Damien stood across the platform in his ceremonial coat, tall and broad, his dark eyes catching the firelight. He did not look at her the way a man looks at the woman he is about to crown. He looked past her, toward the crowd, as if searching for someone else. Elena told herself she was imagining things. Nerves, she thought. Everyone gets nervous before a big moment like this. The pack elder, a thin old man named Edwin, raised his staff and struck it against the platform 3 times. The crowd fell silent. Even the fire seemed to lower itself, as if it too wanted to hear what came next. "Tonight," Edwin announced, his voice carrying across the grounds, "our Alpha King will name the woman who stands beside him as Luna of this pack. A bond that was sealed 3 years ago will now be sealed before all of you, in fire and in blood." Elena's heart pounded so hard, she was certain the people nearest to her could hear it. She looked at Damien, silently begging him to look back at her, to give her some small sign that everything was as it should be. He did not. Instead, Damien stepped forward, and his voice, when it came, was steady and cold, in a way she had never heard from him before. "I cannot accept this bond," he said. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Elena's mind refused to process the words, as though her brain had decided that if she did not understand them, they could not be true. "I reject Elena as my mate," Damien continued, and this time his voice was louder, meant to be heard by everyone at the back of the crowd. "The bond between us is broken, by my will, tonight." The words hit her like a physical blow. Elena felt her knees weaken, and she had to lock them to keep from falling. A wave of gasps rolled through the crowd, followed by murmurs that grew louder with every passing second. Somewhere behind her, she heard someone say her name in a tone of pity, and that was almost worse than the rejection itself. She wanted to ask him why. She wanted to scream the word until her throat gave out, but her voice would not come. She simply stood there, frozen, while the fire crackled and the wind carried the scent of smoke across the grounds. Then Damien turned, and what he did next broke something inside her that she would never fully repair. He reached out his hand toward the crowd, toward a woman who stood near the front, a woman with the same golden hair as Elena, the same shape of jaw, the same quiet grace that came from years of careful training in pack politics. Celine, Elena's own mother, stepped forward and placed her hand in his. "I name Celine as my Luna," Damien said. "She will stand beside me as the true partner of this pack, from this night forward." The crowd's murmurs turned into a roar of shocked approval, the kind of noise that comes when people cannot decide if they are witnessing a scandal or a triumph, so they simply make noise because the moment demands it. Elena watched her mother's face, waiting to see shock, waiting to see denial, waiting for Celine to pull her hand away and say this was a mistake, a joke, anything other than what it appeared to be. Celine did not pull away. She lifted her chin, and for one terrible second, her eyes met Elena's. There was no apology in them. There was something closer to triumph. Elena understood, in that instant, that her mother had known. Perhaps not the exact night, perhaps not the exact words, but she had known this was coming, and she had done nothing to stop it. Worse, she had positioned herself to benefit from it. The betrayal was so large that Elena's mind could not hold both parts of it at once. She kept switching between the pain of Damien's rejection and the horror of her mother's willingness, unable to decide which wound was cutting deeper. Around her, pack members began to whisper, some sympathetic, some cruel, a few even laughing behind raised hands, as though her humiliation were a form of entertainment they had been waiting all year to see. She thought of the 3 years that had led to this moment. She thought of the nights Damien had sat with her on the ridge overlooking the northern hills, speaking softly about the future of the pack and, though he never said it outright, about their future together. She thought of the way he used to find reasons to walk past her window, The way his wolf had once nuzzled against her shoulder in the training yard, while the older warriors pretended not to notice. None of that mattered now. None of it had been real enough to survive one ceremony. Edwin, the elder, cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the shift in the room's energy, but unwilling to stop a ceremony that had already been declared. "The bond is broken and reformed," he said, his staff tapping once more against the wood. "Let it be recorded. Selene stands as Luna of this pack." Elena felt something rise in her chest, hot and sharp, and for a moment, she thought she might cry in front of everyone. In front of the man who had just discarded her, and the mother who had just replaced her. She would not give either of them that satisfaction. She straightened her spine. She lifted her chin the same way her mother had, though for entirely different reasons, and she turned, slowly, deliberately, so that everyone watching would see that she was leaving on her own terms, not being chased away. As she walked past Damien, close enough that she could smell the cedar and smoke scent that always clung to him, she paused. Just for a heartbeat, long enough to look directly into his eyes one final time. She did not say a word. She did not need to. Whatever he saw in her expression made something flicker across his face, something that looked almost like doubt, almost like the beginning of regret. But he said nothing either, and the moment passed as quickly as it had come. Elena walked through the crowd, and the pack members parted to let her pass, some out of respect, some simply because they did not want to be too close to whatever was happening inside her. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at any of the familiar faces that had watched her grow up in this pack, faces that were now watching her walk away from everything she had once believed would be hers. Near the edge of the grounds, she passed her childhood friend, Grace, a young woman with kind eyes and a habit of speaking her mind at the worst possible times. Grace reached out as if to stop her, to offer comfort or an explanation, but Elena shook her head slightly, a silent request to be let go. Grace's hand fell back to her side, and Elena kept walking. She did not go back to the small cottage she shared with her mother. She could not stand the thought of sleeping under that roof for even one more night, knowing what her mother had done, knowing what her mother had allowed to happen. Instead, Elena walked straight to the edge of the pack's territory, toward the old stone bridge that marked the boundary between their land and the neutral forest beyond. The night air was cold, and she had left without a coat, but the chill outside was nothing compared to the chill that had settled inside her chest. She stood on the bridge for a long moment, looking out at the dark trees beyond, and she thought about everything she was leaving behind. Her home, her friends, the only pack she had ever known, and the secret she carried, one that no one else in the world yet knew. Elena placed a hand over her stomach, a gesture so small and quick that anyone watching from a distance would not have noticed it at all. She had known for 3 weeks now, ever since the healer had confirmed what her body had already been trying to tell her. She had planned to tell Damien tonight, after the crowning, once they were alone and the pressure of the ceremony had passed. She had imagined his face lighting up with joy, imagined the two of them planning a future together as mates and as parents. That future no longer existed. Damien had made his choice, publicly and without hesitation, and there was no version of tonight where she could walk back into that circle of firelight and tell him the truth. If she told him now, he would think she was trying to manipulate her way back into his favor, or worse, he might try to keep her here out of duty rather than love, tied to a crown that had never truly wanted her. She would not do that to herself, and she would not do that to her child. Elena made her decision standing on that bridge, with the cold wind pulling at her hair, and the distant sound of celebration drifting from the pack grounds behind her. Celebration for a Luna who was not her, in a life that was no longer hers. She would leave, and she would raise her child somewhere far from this place, somewhere the shadow of the Alpha King's rejection could not reach either of them. She thought of her mother one last time before she crossed the bridge. She thought of the years Selene had spent teaching her how to walk, how to speak, how to carry herself with the dignity expected of a future Luna. All of it, it seemed now, had been preparation, not for Elena's future, but for her mother's own ambition. Selene had raised her daughter to be perfect for the role, and then had taken that role for herself the moment it became available. Elena wondered, briefly, if her mother had ever loved her at all, or if she had simply been a useful piece in a longer plan. The thought was too painful to hold for long, so she pushed it away and focused instead on the path ahead of her, the dark trees, and the unknown miles between here and wherever she would end up. She had a small bag with her, one she kept packed in case of emergencies, a habit left over from childhood lessons about always being ready to run if danger came to the pack. She had never imagined the danger would come from inside her own family, from the man she loved and the mother who raised her. But the bag was ready, and so, she told herself, was she. Before she stepped off the bridge and into the unknown forest beyond, Elena allowed herself one final look back at the fire glowing in the distance, at the shapes of pack members still gathered around it, celebrating a bond that had been built on her humiliation. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry, not here, not where anyone might see her weakness and mistake it for defeat. Instead, she turned her back on the fire, on the pack, on the Alpha King, and the new Luna standing beside him, and she walked into the dark trees without looking back again. The forest was quiet at first, the kind of quiet that made every snapped twig and rustling leaf sound like an explosion. Elena's wolf senses sharpened as she moved deeper into unfamiliar territory, her ears catching every small sound, her eyes adjusting slowly to the darkness beneath the canopy. She had never traveled this deep into the neutral lands before. As a member of Damien's pack, she had never needed to. Now, the safety of that pack no longer belonged to her. She walked for hours, her thoughts circling back again and again, to the moment Damien's voice had cut through the ceremony, rejecting her in front of everyone who had ever known her. She replayed her mother's face, the calm acceptance in her eyes when Damien took her hand. She tried to make sense of it, tried to find some explanation that did not end in complete betrayal, but no matter how she turned the pieces, they only ever formed the same terrible picture. By the time the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Elena's legs ached and her feet were sore from walking without proper shoes for the forest terrain. She found a small clearing near a stream and allowed herself to rest, sitting on a flat rock and letting the sound of running water fill the silence where her thoughts had been screaming all night. She placed her hand over her stomach again, more deliberately this time. "It's just us now," she whispered to the quiet morning air. "I promise I'll figure this out." As if in answer, a soft warmth seemed to spread through her chest, though she knew it was far too early to feel anything from the child growing inside her. Perhaps it was simply her own resolve settling into place, the decision she had made on the bridge solidifying into something she could carry forward, one step at a time. She thought about where she might go. She had heard of other packs in the region, some friendly, some indifferent to outsiders, but she did not want to join another pack structure, not after what had happened in her own. She had also heard whispers of small independent settlements where wolves lived outside the traditional pack system, gathering in loose communities without an alpha ruling over them. It sounded strange, even a little frightening, but it also sounded like exactly the kind of freedom she needed right now. There was a town 2 days' walk from where she sat, a place called Millbrook, that she had heard mentioned by traders who occasionally visited her old pack's markets. It was known as a neutral settlement, welcoming to wolves and humans alike, far enough from any major pack territory that the political games of Alphas and Lunas rarely touched its streets. It seemed as good a destination as any, perhaps the only real option she had. Elena rose from the rock, brushed the dirt from her dress, and began walking again, this time with a clearer sense of direction, even if her heart was still a storm of grief and anger. She thought about the months ahead of her, about carrying a child alone, about building a life from nothing in a town where she knew no one. It should have terrified her more than it did. Instead, there was a strange kind of clarity in it, as though the worst had already happened, and now there was nothing left to do but move forward. By midday, she reached a small trading post at the edge of the neutral forest, a cluster of wooden buildings where humans and wolves conducted business, without the usual formalities of pack territory. She used a small amount of coin she had brought with her to buy proper shoes, a warm cloak, and a bit of food, careful not to draw attention to herself or explain where she had come from. The shopkeeper, an older woman with kind eyes, asked no questions, simply took her coin and wished her safe travels. Elena continued on toward Millbrook, and as the hours passed, her mind slowly began to shift from grief to planning. She would need work when she arrived. She would need a place to stay, somewhere safe and quiet where she could carry her pregnancy without interference from anyone who might recognize her connection to the Alpha King's pack. She would need to build an entirely new identity, one that had nothing to do with the daughter who had been rejected on a firelit platform in front of hundreds of witnesses. As she walked, she allowed herself, for the first time since the ceremony, to think about the child she carried. A small flicker of something warm broke through the layers of pain and anger, something that almost resembled hope. Whatever else had been taken from her that night, this remained hers alone. Damien did not know. Celine did not know. Whatever happened next, this secret was hers to keep or reveal on her own terms, not theirs. She thought about names, briefly, before pushing the thought away as too soon, too tender for a moment when she still did not know where she would sleep that night. But the thought had planted itself, and she found herself smiling faintly despite everything, a small, private smile that no one in the forest could see or take from her. Night fell again before she reached the outskirts of Millbrook, and Elena made camp beneath a large oak tree, wrapping herself in the cloak she had purchased, and trying to rest despite the strange sounds of the unfamiliar forest around her. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by dreams that mixed the crackling fire of the ceremony with the sound of Damien's voice rejecting her, over and over, until she woke with her heart pounding, and tears finally slipping down her cheeks in the darkness, where no one could see. She let herself cry then, quietly, for the life she had imagined and lost, for the mother who had chosen ambition over her own daughter, for the uncertain path ahead of her. She let herself grieve, because she knew that once she reached Millbrook, once she began building her new life, there would be little time left for grief. There would only be the work of surviving, of protecting the small life growing inside her, of becoming someone strong enough to carry both of their futures alone. By morning, her tears had dried, and something harder had settled into place behind her eyes. She rose before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, packed her small bag, and continued walking toward Millbrook, toward whatever waited for her there. She did not know, as she walked, that behind her, in the pack she had left, the first cracks were already beginning to show in the crown Damien had placed on her mother's head. She did not know that the bond he had rejected so easily would not release its hold on him as simply as he had hoped. She only knew that she was walking away, and that for the first time in 3 years, the path ahead of her belonged entirely to her. The gates of Millbrook came into view just after midday, wooden and unassuming, marking the edge of a town that knew nothing of Alpha Kings, or broken bonds, or the daughter of a newly crowned Luna. To the people of Millbrook, Elena would simply be a new arrival, a young woman seeking a quiet place to start over. She intended to keep it that way for as long as she possibly could. She paused at the gates for a moment, taking a slow breath, and then she walked through them, leaving behind everything she had once been, and stepping into everything she was about to become. Millbrook smelled of fresh bread and river water, a combination Elena had never encountered in her old pack's territory, where the scent of pine and wood smoke dominated everything. She walked through the narrow main street, taking in the mix of wolves and humans moving about their day without the rigid hierarchy she had grown up with. No one bowed. No one stepped aside for an approaching Alpha's family member. People simply lived, buying vegetables from a cart, arguing cheerfully over the price of fish, calling greetings to neighbors from open windows. It was strange and wonderful all at once, and Elena felt something in her chest loosen slightly, the tight knot of grief and fear easing just enough to let her breathe a little easier. She found a small inn near the edge of town, called the Willow Room, run by a wolf woman named Margaret who looked to be in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and sharp, assessing eyes that seemed to take in everything about Elena in a single glance. Margaret did not ask where Elena had come from, or why she was traveling alone. She simply asked if Elena could pay for a room, and when Elena produced the coins, Margaret nodded and led her upstairs. "You look tired," Margaret said, as she handed Elena a key. "And you look like someone who's carrying more than that little bag on your shoulder." Elena said nothing, but something in her face must have confirmed Margaret's suspicion, because the older woman's expression softened slightly. "No questions from me," Margaret said. "Not unless you want to ask them of yourself first. Rooms at the end of the hall. There's a wash basin and a decent bed. Breakfast is included, but you'll need to find your own supper." "Thank you," Elena managed, her voice rougher than she expected after 2 days of walking, and very little speaking. Margaret studied her for a moment longer. "If you're looking for work, the bakery down the street is always short-handed. Owner's name is Nathaniel. Fair man. Doesn't ask too many questions either, so long as you're honest with him about your hours. Elena thanked her again, genuinely grateful for the unexpected kindness, and made her way to the small room at the end of the hall. It was simple, containing only a bed, a wash basin, a small table, and a single window that looked out over the town's rooftops, toward the distant tree line. It was nothing like the comfortable cottage she had shared with her mother, but it was hers, at least for as long as her coin lasted, and that mattered more than she had expected it to. She sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself a moment of stillness, the first true stillness she had experienced since the ceremony. Her body ached from the journey, and her mind still replayed fragments of that night, but beneath the exhaustion, she felt something else beginning to take root, the quiet determination to build something new. The next morning, Elena walked to the bakery Margaret had mentioned. The scent of fresh bread reached her before she even opened the door, and inside she found a wide, cheerful man, with flour dusted across his apron, humming to himself as he pulled trays from a large stone oven. "You must be Nathaniel," she said, remembering Margaret's description. He turned, wiping his hands on his apron, and gave her a friendly smile. "That's me. And you'd be the young woman Margaret mentioned might come looking for work. She sent word this morning, said you seemed capable and in need of a place to earn your keep." Elena blinked, surprised at Margaret's efficiency, but grateful for it nonetheless. "Yes, I'm looking for work. I can bake, I can manage accounts. I'm a quick learner if there's something I don't already know." Nathaniel studied her for a moment, the same assessing look Margaret had given her, though his held more warmth. "Can you start today?" And so began Elena's new life in Millbrook, kneading dough and managing the bakery's small ledger books, learning the rhythms of a town that operated entirely differently from the pack she had left behind. The work was hard, especially as the weeks passed, and her pregnancy began to make itself known in small, undeniable ways, but it gave her purpose, and purpose was exactly what she needed to keep from drowning in the grief she still carried. She told no one about the child at first, wrapping herself in looser clothing and working through the early tiredness that came with the first months. But Margaret, sharp-eyed as ever, noticed within the first month. "You're eating for two now, aren't you?" Margaret said one evening, when Elena came down to the inn's small common room for a bowl of soup after a long day at the bakery. Elena froze, spoon halfway to her mouth. "I don't know what you mean." Margaret gave her a look that made it clear the older woman was not going to be argued out of what she already knew. "I've run this inn for 20 years, girl. I know the signs. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, but you don't have to pretend with me either." Something in Elena broke loose at those words, some tension she had been carrying since the moment she left the pack grounds. She set down her spoon, and to her own surprise, she began to speak, quietly at first, then with more urgency, telling Margaret fragments of what had happened, careful to leave out names and details that might reveal exactly who she was or where she had come from. She spoke of a rejection, of a betrayal, of a decision to leave and build a new life alone. Margaret listened without interrupting, her weathered face unreadable, until Elena finished. Then she reached across the table and placed a hand over Elena's. "You're not the first woman to walk into Millbrook carrying more than a travel bag," Margaret said, "and you won't be the last. Whatever happened back where you came from, you're safe here. This town doesn't care about pack politics or crowns or bonds. We care about who shows up and does honest work and treats their neighbors decently. You've done both since the day you arrived." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, the first kindness that had truly reached her since the ceremony. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found this place." "You'd have found somewhere else," Margaret said matter-of-factly. "Women like you always land on their feet eventually, but I'm glad it was here." From that day forward, Margaret became something like family to Elena, checking in on her health as the pregnancy progressed, offering advice about the changes her body was going through, and eventually, helping her find a small apartment above the bakery, when Nathaniel offered it at a reduced rate, in exchange for Elena managing the shop's early morning hours. Nathaniel, too, proved to be more of a friend than an employer. When Elena's condition became visible enough that she could no longer hide it, he simply adjusted her duties without comment, moving her away from the heavier lifting and toward the front counter and the ledgers, work that suited her condition without ever making her feel like a burden. Word spread quietly through Millbrook that the new baker's assistant was expecting a child and raising it alone, but no one treated her with anything other than ordinary kindness. A few of the older women in town, remembering their own difficult years, brought her small gifts of baby clothing or offered advice about the coming months. A young human woman named Charlotte, who ran the flower stall 2 doors down from the bakery, became a close friend, often stopping by during quiet afternoons to share tea and conversation that had nothing to do with Elena's past and everything to do with building a future. Elena found herself, slowly and unexpectedly, building a life that felt entirely her own, free from the expectations that had shaped every day of her existence in her old pack. She was no longer the daughter being groomed for a Luna's crown. She was no longer waiting for a man to decide whether she was worthy of his bond. She was simply Elena, a young mother-to-be, working hard and finding small moments of joy in a town that had welcomed her without question. But even as the weeks passed and her new life took shape, she could not entirely escape the shadow of what she had left behind. Some nights, she dreamed of the fire pit and the platform, of Damien's cold voice rejecting her in front of everyone she had ever known. Some mornings, she woke with her mother's face fresh in her mind, the calm acceptance in Celine's eyes as she took Damien's hand, and the pain of that betrayal would settle over her like a heavy blanket she could not quite shake off. She wondered, sometimes, what was happening back at her old pack. She wondered if anyone had noticed her absence beyond the initial gossip, if her disappearance had caused any ripple at all in the celebration of the new Luna's crowning. She told herself it did not matter, that she had chosen this path and would not look back, but the questions lingered anyway, quiet and persistent beneath the surface of her daily routine. One evening, nearly 4 months after her arrival in Millbrook, Elena sat with Charlotte in the small garden behind the flower shop, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Charlotte had become the closest thing Elena had to a true confidant in her new life, though even with her, Elena had shared only the barest outline of her past. "Do you ever think about going back?" Charlotte asked, her tone gentle, careful not to push too hard into territory Elena had made clear she did not like to discuss in detail. Elena considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I think about it sometimes. Not because I want to return to what I left, but because there are things I still don't understand. Why it happened. What made the people I trusted choose what they chose. Do you think you'll ever get those answers?" "I don't know," Elena admitted, resting a hand over the curve of her stomach, now unmistakably visible beneath her dress. "But I've decided it doesn't matter as much as it used to. I have someone else to think about now. Someone whose future doesn't depend on anyone back there ever explaining themselves to me." Charlotte smiled softly. "That's a strong way to look at it." "It's the only way I can look at it," Elena said. "If I spend all my time wondering why they did what they did, I'll never build anything new. And this," she gestured to the garden around them, to the town beyond it, to the life she had constructed piece by piece since her arrival. "This is worth building." As the months continued to pass, Elena's bond with the town deepened. She learned the names of every shopkeeper on the main street, learned which children liked to sneak extra pastries from the bakery's back door, learned the rhythms of a community that operated on kindness and mutual support rather than rigid pack hierarchy. She began to imagine, for the first time since the ceremony, a future that did not feel entirely defined by loss. She thought often about the child growing inside her, wondering what they would look like, what kind of person they would become. She made small plans, tucking away extra coin whenever she could, preparing a corner of her small apartment with a simple wooden cradle that Nathaniel had built for her without being asked, simply setting it inside her door one evening, with a shy smile and a mumbled excuse about having extra wood lying around the workshop. Elena had cried when she saw it, overwhelmed by the unexpected generosity, and Nathaniel had shifted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with displays of emotion, but pleased nonetheless that his gift had been well received. "Every child deserves a proper place to sleep," he had said simply. "Doesn't matter how they came into this world or who their father might be. That's between you and whatever choices you made. This is just wood and nails." It was more than wood and nails to Elena, and she treasured it as a symbol of the community she had found, one that asked nothing of her except honesty and hard work, one that offered acceptance without the political calculations that had defined every relationship in her old pack. As her due date approached, Margaret arranged for a healer in town, a calm and capable wolfwoman named Vivian, to check on Elena regularly, ensuring both mother and child remained healthy through the final months of pregnancy. Vivian, like everyone else in Elena's new circle, asked few questions about her past, focusing instead on the present and the practical matters of preparing for a safe delivery. "Everything looks healthy," Vivian told her during one of the final checkups, her hands gentle as she examined Elena's stomach. "Strong heartbeat, good size. Whoever the father is, this child seems determined to thrive despite everything." Elena managed a small smile at that. "I think that's exactly right. Determined, despite everything." Late one night, nearly 8 months into her pregnancy, Elena sat by her window, looking out over the moonlit rooftops of Millbrook, and allowed herself to think, truly think, about the child's father for the first time in weeks. She wondered if Damien ever thought of her, if the bond he had so easily rejected had left any mark on him at all, or if he had simply moved forward with Celine as his Luna, building the life he had chosen without a single backward glance toward the daughter he had discarded. She did not know, of course, that hundreds of miles away, in the pack she had left behind, Damien's nights had become increasingly restless, his strength inexplicably diminished, his control over his own pack beginning to fray in ways the elders whispered about, but did not yet understand. She did not know that the bond he had rejected had not released him nearly as cleanly as he had believed it would. She only knew her own truth, that she was building a life, alone, but not truly alone, surrounded by people who had chosen to care for her, without any obligation to do so, preparing to welcome a child who would never know the crown that had been denied to their mother, would never carry the weight of a rejection they had not yet been born to witness. Elena placed both hands over her stomach and felt the child shift beneath her palms, a small, reassuring movement that had become her favorite part of each day. "Almost time," she whispered into the quiet room. "Almost time to meet you." Outside, Millbrook settled into its nightly quiet, the lanterns along the main street flickering steadily, the distant sound of the river providing a gentle backdrop to the town's rest. Elena closed her eyes, and for the first time in many months, she allowed herself to feel something close to peace, a fragile but genuine sense that whatever had been broken in her old life, something new and worthwhile was being built in its place. She had no way of knowing, as she drifted toward sleep that night, how soon the walls she had built around her old life would begin to shake, or how the secret she carried so carefully would eventually reach the ears of the very people she had left behind. For now, in the quiet of her small apartment above the bakery, surrounded by the community that had become her family, Elena allowed herself to simply exist, to breathe, to prepare for the arrival of the child who would carry both her strength and, unknowingly, the blood of a king who did not yet know he had a son or daughter waiting to be born. The pack grounds had never looked more prosperous. Banners in silver and blue hung from every post, celebrating the new Luna's first season in her role, and the elders spoke openly of a golden era beginning for the pack under Damien and Celine's joint rule. To any outsider watching, it appeared as though the Alpha King had made a wise and calculated choice, trading a lesser bloodline for a woman with decades of political experience and unshakable composure. Celine wore her new title with practiced ease, greeting visiting dignitaries with the same confidence she had once used to prepare her daughter for that very role. She organized feasts, settled minor disputes among pack members with fair and measured judgment, and by all outward appearances, she was exactly what the pack needed in a Luna. But Damien knew, even if he refused to admit it aloud, that something was wrong. It began as small things, a restlessness in his chest that he could not shake, even during moments that should have brought him peace, a difficulty sleeping that no remedy from the pack healer seemed able to cure. He found himself standing at his window some nights, staring out toward the neutral forest that bordered the pack's territory, unable to explain why his gaze kept drifting in that direction, as though some invisible thread was pulling his attention toward the darkness beyond the trees. He told himself it was simply the stress of a new political arrangement, the pressure of ensuring the pack accepted Celine as their Luna, without the awkwardness of her having replaced her own daughter in the role. He told himself the sleepless nights would pass, that his strength would return, once his body adjusted to the new rhythm of his life. It did not pass. If anything, it grew worse. 3 weeks after the crowning, during a routine training session with his warriors, Damien found himself struggling to maintain the level of strength and speed that had once come to him effortlessly. He shifted into his wolf form to spar with his second-in-command, a broad and capable man named Owen, and within minutes found himself pinned to the ground, something that had not happened in years of training together. Owen shifted back to his human form immediately, concern etched across his face. "Alpha, are you unwell?" Damien rose slowly, shaking dirt from his fur before shifting back himself, his breathing heavier than it should have been after such a brief exchange. "I'm fine," he said, though the words felt hollow even to himself. "Simply distracted. It won't happen again." But it did happen again, in the days and weeks that followed. His control over the pack's collective bond, the invisible thread that connected an alpha to every member of his pack and allowed him to sense their moods, their locations, their general well-being, began to weaken in ways that unsettled the elders deeply. Pack members reported feeling less connected to their alpha's presence, a strange and unfamiliar distance settling over bonds that had always felt solid and reassuring. Edwin, the elder who had presided over the crowning ceremony, requested a private audience with Damien nearly a month after Celine's ascension to Luna. He arrived at Damien's study with a grave expression, closing the door behind him before speaking. "Alpha, I must ask you something delicate," Edwin began, choosing his words with obvious care. "Have you noticed a change in your strength since the crowning ceremony?" Damien's jaw tightened. He had hoped no one else had noticed what he had been trying to hide, even from himself. "What are you suggesting, Edwin?" "I am not suggesting anything yet," the elder said carefully. "I am asking, because the old texts speak of consequences when an alpha rejects a true mate bond, especially one that was as strong as the bond you shared with Elena. The texts say that a rejected bond does not simply disappear, it lingers, sometimes for years, draining the strength of the one who rejected it until the wound is somehow resolved. That's superstition," Damien said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Old stories meant to frighten young alphas into accepting mates they don't want." "Perhaps," Edwin allowed, "but I have served this pack for 4 decades, Alpha, and I have never seen an alpha's strength decline so sharply in so short a time, without illness, without injury, without any clear cause. I would be failing in my duty if I did not raise the possibility, however uncomfortable it may be." Damien said nothing for a long moment, staring out his study window toward the same distant tree line that had been pulling at his attention for weeks. "Even if what you say is true," he finally said, "there is nothing to be done about it now. The crowning has taken place. Celine is Luna. I cannot simply reverse a decision made in front of the entire pack." Edwin studied him carefully. "No, Alpha. But you might consider finding Elena, if only to understand what truly happened that night, and whether there is any way to ease whatever consequence the bond's rejection may have set in motion." "And how would I even begin to find her?" Damien asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "She left that same night. No one has seen or heard from her since. She could be anywhere by now." Edwin had no answer to that, and the conversation ended without resolution, leaving Damien alone, with thoughts he had been trying desperately to avoid since the night of the ceremony. He found himself, more and more often, replaying the moment on the platform, the moment he had spoken the words of rejection, while looking anywhere but directly at Elena's face. He remembered, though he had tried hard to forget, the brief look she had given him as she passed him on her way out of the ceremony, a look that had haunted the edges of his sleep ever since. He had told himself, in the days leading up to the crowning, that rejecting Elena was the right choice for the pack. Celine had decades of political experience. She understood alliances, understood the delicate balance required to maintain peace with neighboring territories. Elena, for all her natural grace and kindness, was young, untested, more concerned with the well-being of individual pack members than with the larger strategic picture that came with ruling. He had convinced himself, somewhere along the way, that choosing strategy over connection was the mark of a strong leader. Now, weeks later, watching his own strength decline and his control over the pack bond weaken, he was no longer certain that conviction had been correct. Celine, for her part, seemed entirely unbothered by the growing tension within the pack. She continued her duties as Luna, with the same practiced confidence, hosting gatherings, mediating disputes, presenting herself as the steady hand the pack needed during what she called a period of transition. If she noticed Damien's declining strength, she said nothing of it, at least not directly to him. But others noticed the growing distance between the Alpha King and his new Luna, a coldness that had nothing to do with public duty, and everything to do with the private reality that Damien could not bring himself to feel the warmth toward Celine that a true mate bond should have provided. Their public appearances remained flawless, but behind closed doors, conversations between them grew shorter, more transactional, focused entirely on pack business, and never straying into anything resembling genuine affection. One evening, nearly 6 weeks after the crowning, Celine found Damien standing alone on the same ridge overlooking the northern hills where he had once spent quiet evenings with Elena. She approached carefully, sensing the tension in his shoulders even from a distance. "You're thinking about her," Celine said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Damien did not turn to look at her. "I think about many things, Celine. The pack's harvest preparations, the upcoming meeting with the Eastern Territory, whether Owen's training schedule needs adjustment." "You're thinking about Elena," Celine repeated, her voice sharper this time. "I can see it in your face whenever you believe no one is watching." Damien finally turned to face her, and something in his expression made Celine take an involuntary step back. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Taking the crown that should have gone to your own daughter?" Celine's composure faltered, just slightly, before she recovered it. "I did what was best for the pack, and for our families standing within it. Elena would have understood eventually, once she saw how much stronger our position became, with an experienced Luna at your side." "Would she have?" Damien's voice carried an edge Celine had not heard from him before. "Because from where I stand, all I've done since that ceremony is grow weaker, and I have to wonder if the bond I rejected is punishing me for choosing wrong." Celine's face paled slightly at that, though she quickly masked it with the same composed expression she wore for every public appearance. "You're speaking nonsense, Damien. Old wives' tales about rejected bonds are just that. Stories meant to frighten young wolves into obedience." "Edwin doesn't seem to think so," Damien said quietly. "And neither, increasingly, do I." Celine had no response to that, and the two of them stood in uncomfortable silence on the ridge, watching the sun set over hills that had once held gentler memories for Damien. Memories he could not seem to escape no matter how hard he tried. That night, alone in his private chambers, Damien found himself thinking, for the first time since the ceremony, about the possibility that he had made a terrible mistake. He thought about Elena's quiet strength, her genuine care for every pack member regardless of their status, the way she had never once, in 3 years of courtship, pushed him toward decisions that served only her own ambition. He thought about the warmth he had felt in her presence, a warmth that had been entirely absent from every interaction with Celine since the crowning. He had chosen strategy over connection, believing it made him a stronger leader. Now, watching his own body weaken and his pack bond fray, he was beginning to understand that perhaps the two were never meant to be separated at all, that the strength of an alpha king was never meant to exist, apart from the strength of a genuine bond, freely chosen and freely given. But it was too late to take back the words he had spoken on that platform. Elena was gone, somewhere beyond his reach, and Celine wore the crown he had placed on her head in front of the entire pack. Whatever mistake he had made, he would have to live with its consequences, even as those consequences slowly eroded the strength that had once made him the most formidable alpha in the region. He did not yet know how deep those consequences would run, or how far they would eventually reach. He did not know that hundreds of miles away, in a small town called Millbrook, a woman he had rejected was preparing to bring his child into the world, a child who carried not just his blood, but the true mate bond he had so carelessly discarded, a bond that would not release its hold on him until the truth he had refused to see was finally brought into the light. For now, Damien simply stood at his window each night, staring toward the tree line, feeling the pull of something he could not name and could not escape, while behind him, in the halls of a pack he still ruled but no longer fully controlled, whispers grew louder about the price an Alpha King pays when he rejects the bond fate had chosen for him. The first cry of Elena's daughter echoed through the small room above the bakery just before dawn, a sound that brought tears to Vivian's eyes despite her years of experience helping mothers through childbirth. Margaret stood nearby, gripping Elena's hand through the final difficult moments, and Nathaniel waited anxiously downstairs, unable to help but unwilling to leave the building until he knew both mother and child were safe. Elena held her daughter for the first time as the earliest light of morning began to filter through her window, and every ounce of exhaustion from the long night of labor melted away the moment she looked into the tiny face staring back at her. The child had a small tuft of dark hair, the same shade as Damien's, and even in that first quiet moment, Elena could see traces of him in the shape of the baby's eyes, the curve of her small chin. "She's beautiful," Margaret said softly, wiping tears from her own eyes, as she watched Elena cradle her daughter. "What will you name her?" Elena had thought about this moment for months, turning names over in her mind during quiet evenings alone, but now that her daughter was actually here, warm and real in her arms, only one name felt right. "Ren," Elena said quietly. "Her name is Ren." It was a name with no connection to her old pack, no echo of the crown that had been denied to her, simply a small, strong name for a small, strong child who had already survived so much before even taking her first breath in the world. The weeks that followed Ren's birth passed in a blur of exhausted joy for Elena. Margaret and Charlotte took turns helping with the baby whenever Elena needed rest, and Nathaniel adjusted her work schedule at the bakery to accommodate the demands of new motherhood, refusing to let her return to full duties until he was certain she had fully recovered from the birth. Elena found herself falling into a new rhythm of life, one centered entirely around her daughter's needs, her small cries in the night, her first tentative smiles that appeared within the first few weeks, the way her tiny hand would wrap around Elena's finger with surprising strength. The grief and anger that had defined the months following her departure from the pack began to soften, not disappearing entirely, but making room for the fierce, protective love she felt for her daughter. As Ren grew from a tiny infant into an increasingly alert and curious baby, the traces of her father became more and more apparent. Her eyes, which had started out the unremarkable blue-gray common to newborns, gradually deepened into a rich brown that matched Damien's exactly. Her hair, dark from birth, grew thick and slightly wavy, another clear echo of her father's appearance. And there was something else, something Elena noticed with a mixture of pride and quiet worry as Ren approached her first year. Small, faint markings on the child's shoulder blades, markings that Elena recognized immediately as the same royal wolf markings that distinguished direct bloodline heirs within pack hierarchy. Markings she had seen once before, on Damien's own shoulder, during a quiet moment they had shared before everything fell apart. Elena had hoped, perhaps naively, that her daughter might grow up looking more like her own side of the family, allowing her to blend into life in Millbrook without ever raising questions about her true parentage. But as Ren's first birthday approached, it became increasingly clear that her daughter was, unmistakably, the child of an Alpha King, marked by blood, in ways that could not be hidden or explained away by simple coincidence. Margaret noticed the markings first, during a routine bath one evening, when Elena had asked for her help while dealing with a particularly stubborn batch of bread dough downstairs. When Elena returned to check on them, she found Margaret staring at Ren's shoulder blades with an expression of dawning realization. "Elena," Margaret said carefully, "I don't mean to pry, but these markings, I've seen them before, many years ago, on a traveling merchant who claimed distant connection to a royal pack bloodline. Is there something about Ren's father that you haven't told me?" Elena sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, watching her daughter splash happily in the bathwater, entirely unaware of the significance of the marks on her small shoulders. "Her father is the Alpha King of the pack I came from," she said quietly, the words feeling strange after so many months of careful silence. "He rejected me the night I discovered I was pregnant with her, crowned my own mother as Luna instead." Margaret's eyes widened, and for a long moment, she simply stared at Elena, processing the weight of what she had just been told. "And he doesn't know," she finally said. "He doesn't know he has a daughter." "No," Elena confirmed, "and I intend to keep it that way, at least for now. I won't have my daughter used as a political tool by a man who discarded her mother without a second thought." Margaret was quiet for a moment, watching Ren continue her happy splashing, oblivious to the conversation happening above her small head. "I won't tell a soul," Margaret finally said. "You've built something good here, Elena. You and this little one deserve to keep it, without the shadow of pack politics reaching in to disturb it." Elena felt a wave of gratitude wash over her, though beneath it lingered a quiet worry that had been growing steadily since she first noticed the markings on her daughter's shoulders. If Margaret, an outsider with no connection to Damien's pack, could recognize the significance of those markings, it was only a matter of time before someone with closer ties to that world might notice as well, especially as Ren grew older and the markings became more pronounced. That night, after settling her daughter into the small wooden cradle Nathaniel had built, Elena sat by her window and allowed herself to think seriously, for the first time, about what it would mean if Damien ever discovered the truth. She thought about the political weight an heir would carry within pack hierarchy, the way such a discovery could upend the careful balance her mother had worked to establish as Luna, the danger that might come from powerful people suddenly realizing there existed a rival claim to the pack's future leadership. She had chosen to leave, chosen to raise her daughter away from the crown and its complications, and nothing about Ren's existence changed that fundamental decision. But she understood now, more clearly than ever, that her secret was not simply a private matter of the heart. It carried political weight that extended far beyond her own feelings of betrayal and hurt, weight that could reshape the future of an entire pack if it were ever discovered. She resolved, that night, to be even more careful than she had already been, keeping Ren away from any travelers or visitors who might have connections to Damien's territory, ensuring that as her daughter grew, she understood the importance of keeping certain details of her life private, even if she did not yet understand why. As the months turned into a second year, Ren grew into a bright, curious toddler, quick to laugh, and quicker still to explore every corner of the bakery and the small apartment above it. She called Margaret Auntie Meg, and Nathaniel Uncle Nate, forming a small, chosen family around herself that had nothing to do with blood ties or pack hierarchy, and everything to do with genuine care and daily presence. Elena watched her daughter grow with a fierce pride that often brought unexpected tears to her eyes, marveling at the small person Ren was becoming, independent of any expectations tied to the crown she would never know she was entitled to. Ren showed an early fascination with the natural world, often toddling into the small garden behind the flower shop to examine insects and flowers with intense, serious concentration that made Charlotte laugh and comment that the child would likely grow up to be a healer or a scholar of some kind. Elena allowed herself, during these quiet, ordinary moments, to believe that perhaps she had truly succeeded in building a life entirely separate from the pain of her past. Millbrook had become home in every sense that mattered, and Ren was growing up surrounded by love, free from the political calculations that had defined Elena's own childhood. But even as she built this new life, piece by careful piece, Elena could not entirely shake the awareness that somewhere, hundreds of miles away, a father who did not know his daughter existed was ruling a pack that would one day, in some form, need to reckon with the truth of what had happened the night of the crowning ceremony. She did not know how or when that reckoning might come, only that the secret she carried could not remain hidden forever, not with markings as unmistakable as the ones that marked her daughter as an Alpha King's true heir. For now, she allowed herself to focus on the present, on the small joys of watching Ren grow, on the community that had embraced them both without question, on the quiet satisfaction of a life built entirely through her own strength and determination. Whatever the future held, whatever reckoning might eventually come, Elena had given her daughter something precious in these early years, a childhood filled with genuine love, free from the shadow of rejection that had defined her mother's final night in the pack she once called home. Late one evening, as she rocked a sleepy Ren in her arms, humming a quiet tune with no particular melody, Elena found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of Damien, not with the sharp anger that had once consumed her thoughts of him, but with a strange, distant curiosity about the man he might have become in the 2 years since the crowning. She wondered if his strength had ever returned, if the bond he had rejected still haunted him, the way pack legends suggested it might, or if he had simply moved forward, building his reign alongside her mother, without a single backward glance toward the life he had discarded. She would likely never know the answers to these questions, and she told herself, as she placed her sleeping daughter into the small wooden cradle, that it did not matter. Whatever happened in that distant pack, whatever consequences Damien faced for his choices that night, Elena had built something real and lasting in Millbrook, something that no crown or bond or political calculation could ever take away from her or her daughter. She closed the window against the cool night air, extinguished the small lamp beside her bed, and allowed herself to drift toward sleep, unaware that far beyond the borders of the peaceful town she now called home, the consequences of that long-ago rejection were growing more severe with each passing month, drawing steadily closer to a reckoning that would eventually reach even the quiet streets of Millbrook. 2 years after the crowning ceremony, The pack that had once celebrated Celine's ascension to Luna had grown quietly restless, whispers of concern passing between elders and warriors alike as they watched their Alpha King continue to weaken in ways that defied every explanation offered by pack healers. Damien could no longer hold his wolf form for more than a few hours without exhaustion overtaking him. His control over the pack bond had deteriorated to the point where younger wolves reported feeling almost no connection to their alpha's presence at all, a dangerous vulnerability that left the pack's borders less secure than they had been in generations. Edwin, now visibly aged by the stress of watching his pack decline under circumstances he could not fully explain, requested another private audience with Damien, this time bringing with him a stack of ancient texts he had spent months tracking down from libraries in distant territories. "Alpha, I believe I finally understand what has been happening to you," Edwin said, spreading the texts across Damien's study table with hands that trembled slightly from age and urgency. These accounts, gathered from 3 separate pack histories, all describe the same phenomenon. When an alpha rejects a true mate bond, particularly one where the mate is already carrying his child at the time of rejection, the consequences are far more severe than a simple rejection between 2 wolves with no offspring involved. Damien felt something cold settle in his stomach at those words. "What are you saying, Edwin?" "I'm saying," Edwin continued carefully, "that if Elena was pregnant the night you rejected her, the bond you severed was not simply between 2 mates. It was a bond tied to the continuation of your bloodline, a connection that pack magic considers sacred in ways that ordinary rejections do not touch. The texts describe alphas in similar situations losing their strength gradually over years, sometimes decades, unless the truth is acknowledged and the relationship, in some form, is restored." Damien sat down heavily in his chair, his mind racing back to that night, to Elena's face as she stood on the platform, to the strange stillness in her expression that he had never fully understood. He thought of the child that might exist somewhere in the world, a child he had never known about, never had the chance to consider before making the choice that had shaped the last 2 years of his declining strength. "You believe she was pregnant," Damien said slowly, testing the weight of the words. "I cannot know for certain," Edwin admitted, "but the pattern matches too closely for me to ignore the possibility. If there is a child, Alpha, finding them may be the only path toward reversing what has been happening to you, and by extension, to this entire pack." Damien spent that night alone in his study, staring at the ancient texts Edwin had left with him, reading and rereading passages that described consequences eerily similar to his own experience. By the time dawn broke over the pack grounds, he had made a decision that would have seemed impossible to him even a few months earlier. He would search for Elena, not to reclaim a political advantage or restore his own strength, though he could not fully separate that motivation from what was growing inside him, but because he needed, finally, to understand the truth of what he had done that night. He informed Celine of his decision that same morning, finding her in the pack's council chamber reviewing reports from the eastern border territories. She looked up as he entered, her expression shifting quickly from professional composure to guarded wariness as she registered the determination in his face. "I'm going to find Elena," Damien said, without preamble. "I believe she may have been carrying my child the night I rejected her, and I need to know the truth." Celine's face went pale, and for the first time since her crowning, Damien saw something crack in her carefully maintained composure. "That's absurd," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "If Elena had been pregnant, she would have said something. She would have told you." "Would she?" Damien asked, watching Celine's reaction carefully. "After what happened that night, after both of us rejected her in front of the entire pack, why would she trust either of us with something so important? I wouldn't have believed her if she came forward with such news right after the ceremony. I might have thought she was simply trying to manipulate her way back into a position of power." Celine said nothing, but the way her hands tightened around the reports she held told Damien everything he needed to know. She had considered this possibility before, perhaps even known about it, with more certainty than she was willing to admit. "Did you know?" Damien asked directly, his voice hardening. "Did you know Elena was pregnant when you agreed to take her place as Luna?" Celine's silence stretched long enough to serve as its own answer. Finally she spoke, her voice quieter than Damien had ever heard it. "I suspected." She had been unusually tired in the weeks before the ceremony, unusually protective of her stomach during our fittings for the crowning dress. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things because a small part of me wanted an excuse to justify what I was about to do. Damien felt a wave of anger rise in his chest, sharper and more focused than anything he had experienced since the ceremony itself. You let me reject a pregnant woman, your own daughter, without saying a single word about your suspicions. I wanted the crown, Celine said, her composure finally breaking entirely, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. I told myself Elena would understand eventually, that she would find happiness elsewhere, that the pack would be stronger with my experience guiding it. I convinced myself of so many things that night, Damien, and I have lived with the weight of that choice every day since. Does the pack know? Damien asked. Do the elders know what you allowed to happen? No one knows, Celine whispered. I made certain of that. Damien stood, his decision solidifying with each passing moment. That changes today. I'm going to find Elena, and if there is a child, I intend to acknowledge them, regardless of what that means for your position as Luna, or for the careful arrangement you've built over these past 2 years. He left the council chamber without waiting for Celine's response, already beginning to plan how he might track down a woman who had disappeared without a trace 2 years earlier. He called Owen and several of his most trusted warriors into his study that same afternoon, explaining, in careful terms that did not reveal the full weight of what he suspected, that he needed help locating Elena, that pack matters required her testimony on issues related to the crowning ceremony's aftermath. Owen, ever loyal, did not question the explanation too closely, though the look in his eyes suggested he understood there was more to the search than Damien was willing to share directly. We'll find her, Alpha, Owen said simply. Wherever she's gone, we'll find her. The search began in earnest. Warriors dispatched to neighboring territories with careful, discreet inquiries about a young woman, matching Elena's description, who might have arrived in their lands roughly 2 years earlier. Weeks passed without significant progress, the trail cold in most directions, until one of Damien's warriors returned from a routine patrol near the neutral forest, with news of a small trading post whose owner recalled selling supplies to a young woman traveling alone, heading in the direction of a settlement called Millbrook. Damien felt something shift in his chest at the mention of the name, a strange, unexplainable certainty that this was the lead he had been searching for. He set out for Millbrook himself, accompanied only by Owen, choosing to keep the search small and discreet, rather than risk drawing unwanted attention to whatever he might find upon arrival. The journey took nearly a week, following the same path Elena had walked 2 years earlier, though Damien traveled with the advantages of proper supplies and a companion, comforts Elena had not had during her own desperate flight from everything she had once known. As they approached the outskirts of Millbrook, Damien found his heart pounding, with an intensity he had not felt in years, a mixture of hope and dread that made even the simple act of walking feel difficult. He did not know what he would find in this quiet, unfamiliar town, whether Elena had truly settled here, whether there was indeed a child waiting to be discovered, or whether this entire journey would end in another dead end, another failed attempt to understand the consequences of a choice he could never take back. Owen walked beside him in silence, sensing the weight of whatever internal battle his alpha was fighting, offering quiet companionship without demanding explanation. As the wooden gates of Millbrook came into view, the same gates Elena had walked through 2 years earlier, seeking refuge and a chance to build a new life, Damien slowed his pace, suddenly uncertain how to proceed now that the moment of truth was so close at hand. Whatever we find in there, Owen said quietly, breaking the silence between them, you'll handle it the way you handle everything, Alpha, with whatever strength you have left. Damien appreciated the words, even as he wondered privately whether the strength Owen referenced still existed within him at all, worn down as it had been by 2 years of unexplained decline. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as best he could, and walked through the gates of Millbrook, beginning the search that would finally bring him face to face with the truth he had spent 2 years avoiding. The town appeared peaceful in the late afternoon light, wolves and humans moving about their business with the easy familiarity of a well-established community. Damien and Owen made their way toward the town's center, drawing occasional curious glances from residents unaccustomed to unfamiliar faces, particularly ones carrying themselves with the unmistakable bearing of pack royalty despite their attempts at a more modest appearance. They stopped at the first inn they encountered, a place called the Willow Room, where a sharp-eyed older woman behind the front counter watched them approach with an expression that Damien could not quite read, somewhere between wariness and calculation. "Looking for a room?" Margaret asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected their purpose extended beyond simple lodging. "We're looking for someone," Damien said carefully. "A young woman, arrived in this town roughly 2 years ago. Golden hair, quiet manner. Her name is Elena." Margaret's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of recognition quickly masked by careful neutrality. "Lots of young women pass through Millbrook," she said evenly. "Can't say I keep track of every one of them." But Damien, watching her closely, saw the flicker of recognition for exactly what it was, and something in his chest tightened with a mixture of hope and fear at the confirmation that he was, finally, close to finding the answers he had traveled so far to uncover. Margaret's carefully neutral expression did not fool Damien, and he leaned forward against the counter, his voice softening, even as his eyes remained sharp with determination. "Please," he said. "I mean her no harm. I only need to understand what happened, and if there's a child, I need to know." At the mention of a child, Margaret's composure finally cracked, just slightly, enough for Damien to see the truth confirmed in her eyes, even before she spoke a single word. She glanced toward Owen, then back to Damien, seeming to weigh some internal decision before finally speaking. "You're him, aren't you?" she said quietly. "The alpha who rejected her." Damien felt the words land like a physical blow, confirmation of everything Edwin's ancient texts had suggested, everything Celine's guilty silence had implied. "Yes," he admitted, his voice rough. "I am." Margaret studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes seeming to search for something in his expression, some indication of whether he had come to cause further harm, or to finally make amends for a wound that had never fully healed. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, at least enough to continue the conversation. "She works at the bakery down the street," Margaret finally said. "Owned by a man named Nathaniel. But I'll warn you now, Alpha. If you've come here to cause her, or that little girl any trouble, you'll find this whole town standing against you, pack royalty or not." The confirmation of a daughter hit Damien harder than he expected, his knees nearly buckling beneath the weight of 2 years of uncertainty finally resolving into concrete truth. He had a daughter. Somewhere in this quiet town, a child who carried his blood was growing up without any knowledge of the father who had never known she existed. "I've come to make things right," Damien said, his voice thick with emotion he had not expected to feel so intensely. "Whatever that means, whatever Elena decides it should mean, I owe her that much, at the very least." Margaret nodded slowly, seeming to accept his sincerity, though her expression remained watchful. "The bakery closes soon for the evening. If you hurry, you might catch her before she heads home for the night." Damien thanked her, and left the inn immediately, Owen following close behind, both of them making their way through the narrow streets of Millbrook, toward the bakery Margaret had described. Damien's heart pounded with each step, a mixture of anticipation and fear that he had not experienced since the night of the crowning ceremony itself. They found the bakery easily enough, the warm scent of fresh bread still lingering in the evening air, despite the approaching closing hour. Through the front window, Damien could see a young woman moving about behind the counter, her golden hair pulled back in a practical braid, her movements confident and familiar in a way that spoke of years spent perfecting this new routine. It was Elena, older than he remembered, her face carrying a maturity and quiet strength that had not been there 2 years earlier, but unmistakably her. Damien stood frozen outside the bakery window for a long moment, unable to make himself move forward, overwhelmed by the sight of her after so long, by the guilt that surged through him at the thought of everything she must have endured alone since that terrible night. Owen placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, a silent reminder that he had come too far to turn back now. Taking a deep breath, Damien pushed open the bakery door, the small bell above it announcing his entrance with a soft, cheerful chime that felt entirely at odds with the weight of the moment. Elena looked up at the sound, her professional smile already forming to greet a customer, and then freezing entirely as her eyes met Damien's across the small shop. The color drained from her face, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the years of separation and unspoken truth stretching between them like an invisible wall. "Damien," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, Elena, he replied, equally quiet, equally uncertain how to bridge the gap between everything that had happened and this sudden, unexpected reunion. Nathaniel emerged from the back room at that moment, immediately sensing the tension in the shop, his protective instincts flaring as he took in the unfamiliar man standing near the door, and Elena's clearly shaken state. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, positioning himself subtly between Elena and the newcomers. "It's all right, Nathaniel," Elena said, though her voice still trembled slightly. "This is Damien. He's the father of my daughter." The words hung in the air, and Nathaniel's expression shifted from protective wariness to careful assessment, clearly recalibrating his understanding of the situation, now that the truth had been spoken aloud in his own shop. "I need to speak with you," Damien said, taking a tentative step further into the shop. "Alone, if possible. I only just learned, or rather, I only just suspected the truth, and I traveled here to understand it fully. I'm not here to cause trouble, Elena. I only want to know." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the coldness that had defined his rejection 2 years earlier. What she found instead seemed to be genuine uncertainty, even vulnerability, qualities she had rarely seen from him during their years together before the crowning ceremony. "Nathaniel, can you watch the shop for a few more minutes?" she asked, and when he nodded, still watching Damien carefully, she led Damien toward a small table in the corner of the shop, away from the front window and any curious eyes that might be passing by outside. They sat across from each other in tense silence for a long moment before Damien finally spoke. "Edwin, our pack elder, discovered old texts describing consequences when an alpha rejects a mate who is carrying his child. My strength has been declining for 2 years, Elena. My control over the pack bond has weakened to the point where the entire pack's safety is at risk," he believed, and I've come to believe as well, that this decline is connected to what happened that night, to a child I never knew existed. Elena's hands trembled slightly where they rested on the table, but her voice remained steady when she finally spoke. "Her name is Ren. She just turned 2 years old. She has your eyes, Damien, and markings on her shoulders that I believe indicate she carries the bloodline markers of a true heir." Damien felt something break open in his chest at the confirmation, a mixture of overwhelming joy at learning he had a daughter, and devastating grief at realizing he had missed 2 years of her life, 2 years he could never reclaim. "I want to meet her," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "if you'll allow it. I understand if you don't trust me, if you believe I don't deserve that chance after everything that happened, but I need you to know that I am truly sorry, Elena, for all of it, the rejection, the way I handled everything that night, the years you've spent raising our daughter alone without any support from me." Elena was quiet for a long moment, tears gathering in her eyes as 2 years of grief, anger, and hard-won peace collided with the reality of Damien sitting across from her, finally understanding the weight of what he had done. "Why now?" she finally asked. "If your strength hadn't declined, if the pack bond hadn't weakened, would you have ever come looking for me? Or would I have remained forgotten? Another mistake buried in your past?" The question hit Damien hard, and he considered it carefully before answering, understanding that Elena deserved complete honesty, whatever the cost to his own pride. "I don't know," he admitted. "I would like to believe I would have eventually understood the wrongness of what I did, that I would have come searching for you regardless of the consequences to my own strength. But I cannot say that with certainty, and I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. What I can say is that I am here now, and my intention, whatever brought me to this moment, is to make things right, for you and for our daughter, in whatever way you believe is best." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against the memory of that terrible night, against 2 years of building a life entirely without him, against the fierce protective love she felt for the daughter, who had grown up surrounded by chosen family in this small, welcoming town. "She's happy here," Elena finally said. "She has people who love her, a community that has embraced her without any knowledge of the political weight her bloodline carries. I won't have that disrupted, Damien. Whatever happens next, Ren's well-being comes before anything else, before pack politics, before your need to resolve whatever consequence has been draining your strength." "I understand," Damien said quietly. "I don't intend to force anything, Elena. I only want the chance to know her, to be part of her life if you'll allow it. and to make certain that whatever she needs, whatever future she chooses, she has the resources and support of her true bloodline available to her. Their conversation was interrupted by the soft sound of small footsteps on the stairs leading up from the apartment above the bakery, followed by Charlotte's voice calling out that she had brought Wren down for her evening visit with her mother, before bedtime. Elena's eyes widened slightly, a flash of protective instinct crossing her face as she glanced toward the sound. Moments later, a small girl with dark, slightly wavy hair and warm brown eyes came into view, holding Charlotte's hand as she toddled into the main part of the bakery, her attention immediately caught by the unfamiliar man sitting with her mother at the corner table. Damien felt his entire world shift at the sight of her, this small, bright-eyed child who was unmistakably his daughter, carrying traces of his own features mixed with Elena's gentle grace. Wren studied him with the open curiosity of a toddler encountering someone new, tilting her head slightly as though trying to puzzle out exactly who this stranger might be. "Mama," she said, pointing at Damien with the blunt directness only small children possess. "Who's that?" Elena's eyes met Damien's across the table, and in that shared look, both of them understood that whatever happened next, whatever complicated path lay ahead for their family, this moment marked the beginning of a truth that could no longer remain hidden, a reckoning that had finally, after 2 long years, arrived at their door. Elena knelt down to Wren's level, gently taking her small hand and guiding her closer to the table where Damien sat, watching the scene with an expression caught between wonder and overwhelming emotion. "This is someone very important, sweetheart," Elena said carefully, choosing words a 2-year-old could understand, while her own heart raced with the weight of the moment. "This is your father." Wren studied Damien with the frank curiosity of a small child, unbothered by the significance adults attached to such introductions. She reached out a small hand toward him, and Damien, moving carefully as though afraid any sudden motion might shatter the fragile moment, took her tiny fingers in his own much larger hand. "Hello, Wren," he said softly, his voice thick with an emotion he had rarely allowed himself to express so openly. "I've been wanting to meet you for a very long time, even though I didn't know it until recently." Wren giggled at the formality of his greeting, entirely unaware of the political and emotional weight carried by this first meeting between father and daughter. She climbed, without hesitation, onto the chair beside him, immediately beginning to chatter about a caterpillar she had found in Charlotte's garden earlier that day, treating this stranger with the same easy trust she extended to everyone in her small, loving world. Elena watched the interaction, with tears streaming freely down her face now, overwhelmed by the surreal nature of watching Damien meet their daughter for the first time, in the very bakery that had become her sanctuary over the past 2 years. Whatever anger and hurt still lingered from his rejection, she could not deny the genuine tenderness with which he engaged with Wren, listening intently to her disjointed stories about caterpillars and flowers, with a focus that suggested he was memorizing every detail of this precious first conversation. Nathaniel and Charlotte watched from a respectful distance, exchanging glances that communicated their shared protectiveness over both Elena and Wren, ready to intervene if the situation required it, but recognizing, for now, that this moment needed space to unfold naturally. As the evening wore on and Wren eventually grew tired, her chatter slowing, as sleepiness overtook her small frame, Damien found himself facing a decision he had not fully anticipated when he set out from his packed territory weeks earlier. He had come seeking answers, seeking a way to reverse the strange decline that had plagued him since the rejection. He had not fully prepared himself for the overwhelming love that would flood through him upon meeting his daughter, nor for the complicated question of what came next for all of them. "I know this is a great deal to process," Damien said quietly to Elena, once Charlotte had taken a now drowsy Wren back upstairs for her bedtime routine. "I don't expect you to make any decisions tonight, but I need you to understand that I intend to be part of Wren's life going forward, in whatever capacity you believe is appropriate, and I intend to ensure she has access to her birthright as my daughter, regardless of how complicated that might make things politically." Elena wiped the remaining tears from her face, steadying herself before responding. "I won't uproot her life here, Damien. This town, these people, they've become her family, in every way that matters. If you want to be part of her life, it will need to happen in a way that respects what we've built here, not simply demand that we return to a pack that once rejected us both." "I understand," Damien said, and something in his tone suggested genuine acceptance of this condition, rather than mere political calculation. I'm not asking you to return, Elena. I'm asking for the chance to build a relationship with our daughter, on terms you're comfortable with, whether that means regular visits, eventual travel between here and Pact territory when she's older, or whatever arrangement serves her well-being best. The conversation continued late into the evening, both of them navigating the complicated terrain of shared parenthood after 2 years of complete separation. Of political complications neither of them had fully anticipated when Elena first walked through Millbrook's gates carrying her secret alone. By the time Damien and Owen finally departed the bakery for the night, retreating to rooms at the Willow Room that Margaret had grudgingly, but not unkindly, provided, both Elena and Damien understood that their lives had irrevocably changed, though the exact shape of what came next remained uncertain. Over the following days, Damien remained in Millbrook, spending time with Wren under Elena's careful supervision, slowly building the beginnings of a relationship with the daughter he had not known existed until weeks earlier. He watched, with growing understanding, the community that had embraced Elena and Wren so completely, recognizing in Nathaniel's protective care, and Margaret's sharp-eyed watchfulness, and Charlotte's genuine friendship, exactly the kind of support system his own pack, for all its political sophistication, had failed to provide during Elena's most vulnerable moments. He also felt, with each day spent in Wren's presence, a gradual return of strength he had not experienced in 2 years. His control over the pack bond, though he was hundreds of miles from his territory, seemed to steady, as though simply acknowledging his daughter's existence and beginning to build a genuine relationship with her had begun healing whatever wound the rejection had caused. Edwin's ancient texts, it seemed, had been correct after all. On the 5th day of his stay in Millbrook, Damien requested a private conversation with Elena, finding her during a quiet afternoon lull at the bakery, while Wren napped upstairs under Charlotte's watchful care. "I need to return to my pack soon," he said. "Matters there require my attention, and I've imposed on your life here longer than I initially intended. But before I go, I need to tell you something important." Elena waited, watching him carefully, uncertain what new complication he might be about to introduce into their fragile new arrangement. "Celine knew," Damien said quietly. "She suspected you were pregnant the night of the ceremony, and she said nothing, allowing the rejection to proceed regardless. I confronted her about it before I left to search for you, and she confirmed everything. I intend to address this with the pack elders upon my return, though I understand if that news is difficult for you to hear, given everything else you've already had to process." Elena felt a fresh wave of anger rise at the confirmation of her mother's calculated betrayal, though it settled quickly into something closer to weary acceptance. "I suspected as much," she admitted, "but it helps, somehow, to have it confirmed, rather than simply wondered about. What will happen to her position as Luna?" "That remains to be determined," Damien said. "The elders will need to decide how to address such a significant breach of trust from someone in her position. I won't pretend to know exactly how that process will unfold, but I intend to ensure it happens with full transparency, unlike the secrecy that has defined so much of what led us to this point." Elena nodded slowly, absorbing this news alongside everything else that had shifted in her carefully constructed world over the past 5 days. "And what happens with us, Damien? With Wren's place in all of this?" Damien considered the question carefully before answering. "I would like to establish Wren as my acknowledged heir, with all the protections and resources that title provides, even as she continues to grow up here in Millbrook, under your care, surrounded by the community that has loved and protected her these past 2 years. I don't want to disrupt the life you've built, Elena, but I also don't want our daughter to grow up without knowledge of her full heritage, without the option, when she's older, to choose how much of that heritage she wants to claim for herself." It was, Elena had to admit, a more thoughtful and considerate approach than she had expected when Damien first walked through the bakery door 5 days earlier. Whatever mistakes he had made 2 years ago, whatever coldness had defined his choices that terrible night, the man sitting across from her now seemed genuinely committed to making amends, to building something better for their daughter than the political calculations that had once defined his own choices. "I'll consider it," Elena finally said, "but I won't make any final decisions until I've had time to think this through properly, and until I'm certain any arrangement truly serves Wren's best interests, not simply the political needs of your pack." "That's more than fair," Damien agreed. "Take whatever time you need. I'll return to my pack now, to begin addressing matters there, but I would like to maintain contact, to continue building whatever relationship with Wren you're comfortable allowing. and to remain available for whatever conversations we need to have about her future. They parted that evening with a fragile but genuine sense of possibility between them. Neither of them certain exactly what the coming months would hold, but both of them committed, in their own ways, to prioritizing their daughter's well-being above the political complications that had once torn their lives apart. 3 months later, after a difficult but ultimately transparent process that saw Celine stripped of her title as Luna, and the pack elders formally acknowledging Ren as Damien's true heir, Elena traveled to the pack territory for the first time since her departure, bringing Ren with her for a carefully arranged visit designed to introduce their daughter to the broader pack community, while still maintaining Millbrook as her primary home. The pack grounds looked different to Elena now, viewed through the lens of everything she had built and become in the 2 years since she last stood on that platform, humiliated and heartbroken. She walked through the gates not as a rejected daughter seeking acceptance, but as a woman who had built an entirely independent life, returning now on her own terms, for her daughter's sake rather than her own need for validation. Damien met them at the entrance to the pack grounds, and the warmth in his expression as he greeted Ren, now old enough to recognize him and run eagerly toward him with delighted cries of "Papa," spoke to the genuine relationship they had built over months of careful, consistent visits and correspondence. Elena watched her mother, no longer wearing the ceremonial marks of a Luna, standing at a respectful distance during the pack's formal acknowledgement of Ren as Damien's heir, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of regret and quiet acceptance of consequences she had brought upon herself. Celine did not attempt to approach Elena directly, seeming to understand, finally, that whatever relationship might eventually be rebuilt between mother and daughter would need to happen slowly, if it happened at all, and entirely on Elena's terms. As the pack elders formally recognized Ren before the same fire pit where Elena had once been rejected 2 years earlier, Elena felt the weight of that old humiliation finally begin to lift, replaced by something closer to peace. She had not returned seeking revenge or validation from the pack that had once discarded her. She had returned simply to ensure her daughter's future included every resource and opportunity available to her, while the life Elena had built in Millbrook, the community, the friendships, the quiet strength she had discovered within herself, remained entirely her own, untouched by the pack politics that had once defined her entire existence. Damien approached her as the formal ceremony concluded, watching as Ren ran off to explore the pack grounds under Owen's careful supervision, delighted by the discovery of new spaces and new people eager to meet the young heir. "Thank you," he said quietly to Elena, "for allowing this, for trusting me enough to bring her here, even after everything." "I did it for her," Elena said honestly, "not for you, and not for this pack. Whatever trust exists between us now, it exists because you've shown, through months of consistent action, that you're genuinely committed to being a good father to our daughter. That's what matters most to me." Damien nodded, accepting this honest assessment without argument. "Is there any chance, Elena, that trust could eventually extend beyond simply co-parenting Ren? I understand if the answer is no, if too much has happened for us to ever rebuild what we once had. But I needed to ask." Elena considered the question carefully, thinking of everything that had happened since that terrible night, of the life she had built independently, of the strength she had discovered within herself, through 2 years of raising their daughter alone. She thought, too, of the man standing before her now, so different from the cold, distant figure who had rejected her on that platform, a man who had traveled far to find the truth, who had chosen transparency over convenient silence, who had built a genuine, loving relationship with their daughter over months of careful, consistent effort. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I'm willing to find out, slowly, without any pressure or expectation beyond what feels right for both of us, and for Ren. That's the only way I'm willing to move forward, Damien. Slowly, honestly, and always with her well-being as our first priority." Damien smiled, a genuine hopeful expression that Elena had not seen from him since their earliest days together, before pack politics and ambition had complicated everything between them. "Slowly and honestly," he agreed. "That sounds like exactly the right way forward." As the sun set over the pack grounds that evening, casting the same golden light across the fire pit where Elena had once stood humiliated and heartbroken, she watched her daughter laughing freely among pack members who had welcomed her without reservation, watched Damien's genuine joy in his daughter's happiness, and felt, for the first time in 2 years, a sense of complete peace about the path that had brought her to this moment. The secret she had carried alone that terrible night, the truth she had protected so fiercely during her years in Millbrook, had finally come into the light, not through betrayal or political manipulation, but through Damien's own genuine journey toward understanding and accountability. Whatever came next, for their small, unconventional family, spanning 2 very different worlds, Elena knew she faced it now, not as the rejected daughter she had once been, but as a woman who had built her own strength, her own community, her own unshakable sense of self, entirely independent of any crown or bond or political title. Ren's laughter carried across the pack grounds as the first stars began appearing in the darkening sky, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy that represented, more than anything else, the triumph of love and honesty over the pride and ambition that had once threatened to define their family's entire story. And as Elena watched her daughter run freely between the 2 worlds now open to her, she understood that whatever secrets and rejections had shaped their painful beginning, the future they were building together, one honest, careful step at a time, belonged entirely to hope.